You want a family? Then build me a home first. The widow's challenge shook the giant cowboy. The autumn wind carried the scent of sawdust and broken dreams through the muddy streets of Deadwood. Martha Rose stood on her porch, her calloused, hands gripping the weathered railing as she watched the giant of a man approach. Bojack Carter's shadow fell across her small yard like a storm cloud, his boots leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. "Ma'am," he said, removing his worn hat to reveal dark hair streaked with premature silver. At 32, Bojack had the build of a man who could wrestle steers and the eyes of someone who'd seen too much dying. Martha didn't step down from her porch. At 28, she'd learned that height, any advantage, mattered when facing men who thought they could take what they wanted. "Mr. Carter, I came to speak with you about us." The word hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Martha's late husband had been dead 2 years now, claimed by the same fever that took half the town that terrible winter. She'd survived by taking in washing, mending clothes, and keeping her heart locked tighter than the bank vault. "Us." She tilted her head, auburn hair catching the failing light. "I wasn't aware there was an us to discuss." Bojack shifted his weight, his massive frame somehow making him look like a schoolboy called to account. "I know I ain't much to look at, and I know I got a reputation for violence, but I got feelings for you, Martha Rose. Real feelings." "Feelings?" She let the words sit. "And what exactly do you expect me to do with your feelings, Mr. Carter?" He took a step closer, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected: vulnerability. "I want to court you proper. I want to marry you." Martha's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "You want a wife, Mr. Carter? Just like that?" "I want you." "Why?" The question came out harder than she intended. "Because I'm available? Because I'm alone? Because you think a widow should be grateful for any man's attention?" Bojack's jaw tightened. "Because when I see you hanging laundry in the morning light, something in my chest loosens for the first time since I can remember. Because when you smiled at little Tommy Henderson last week, I thought maybe there was still good in this world. Because I'm tired of being alone, and I hope, maybe you are too." The honesty in his voice made her chest ache. She'd been so careful, so guarded. But here was this mountain of a man, feared throughout the territory, laying his heart bare on her doorstep. "You want a family?" she asked quietly. "More than anything." "Then build me a home first." Bojack blinked. "Ma'am?" Martha stepped down from the porch, moving close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "I said, build me a home. With your own 2 hands. Not a shack, not a lean-to, a real home. Windows that close tight, a roof that won't leak, floors that don't sag. You do that, Mr. Carter, and I'll consider your proposal. But you already got a house. I got 4. Walls and a door that barely latches. I got a roof my late husband patched with whatever he could find. I got a home that was built by a man who meant well but never finished anything he started." Her voice grew stronger. "You want me to trust you with my heart? Then show me you can build something that lasts." Bojack stared at her, then at the small house behind her, really seeing it for the first time. The sagging porch, the cracked windows, the chimney that listed to one side like a drunk. I never built nothing before. I mean, nothing like a house." "Then you better learn." "How long do I got?" Martha considered. "Winter comes early in the Dakotas. You got maybe 2 months before the first snow. After that," she shrugged. "Well, I reckon a woman needs a warm house more than she needs a husband." Bojack's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "And if I do this, if I build you a proper home, then I'll open the door when you knock." The next morning, Martha Rose woke to the sound of hammering. She pulled on her robe and stepped onto the porch to find Bojack Carter on his knees in her yard, driving stakes into the ground with methodical precision. "Little early, isn't it?" she called. He looked up, sweat already beading on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. "House won't build itself." She wrapped her arms around herself against the chill. You know what you're doing?" "No, ma'am, but I got this." He held up a battered book, the American Builder's Handbook. "Bought it from the general store last night, along with these." He gestured to a pile of lumber that hadn't been there yesterday. Martha walked down to examine his work. The stakes formed a rectangle about 20 feet by 30, considerably larger than her current house. Ambitious. You said you wanted a real home. And where exactly am I supposed to live while you tear down my current accommodations? Bojack's face reddened. I hadn't thought about that. No, I don't imagine you did. But her tone was gentler than her words. I'll move in with the widow Patterson for a spell. She's been after me for company anyway. I'll pay for your room and board. You will not. Martha's voice brooked no argument. I can take care of myself, Mr. Carter. I've been doing it long enough. Over the next few days, the entire town of Deadwood found reasons to walk past Martha. Rose's property. Bojack Carter, the man who'd knocked out 3 cowboys in a single brawl just last month, was on his hands and knees measuring boards and consulting his handbook like a scholar. You think he knows what he's doing? Asked Mrs. Henderson, pausing to watch Bojack struggle with a particularly stubborn board. Not likely, replied Martha, hanging wet clothes on the line she'd strung between 2 trees. But he's trying. Why'd you ask him to do it? Build the house, I mean. Martha was quiet for a long moment. My Thomas, God rest him, he made a lot of promises. I'll fix that step tomorrow, he'd say. I'll patch that roof come spring. But tomorrow never came for Thomas. There was always something more interesting, more immediate. She pinned a shirt to the line with perhaps more force than necessary. I won't live with half-finished promises again. And if Bojack fails, then I'll know now instead of 10 years from now. That afternoon, Bojack's first wall collapsed. Martha heard the crash from inside the Patterson house and came running. With half the town behind her, she found Bojack sitting in the wreckage, his head in his hands. Son of a bitch, he muttered. Language, Martha said automatically. He looked up at her, his face streaked with dirt and frustration. I can't do this, Martha Rose. I can break a man's jaw, I can rope a steer, I can drink any cowboy in the territory under the table, but I can't make a wall stand up. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur and disperse, sensing the entertainment was over. Martha waited until they were alone before sitting down on a fallen beam beside him. You know what my Thomas used to say when something went wrong? What? Well, now I know one way that doesn't work. She picked up a twisted nail from the debris. How many ways do you suppose there are to build a wall wrong? Despite everything, Bojack almost smiled. Probably a lot. Then you're making progress. That evening, Martha found him still working by lamplight, carefully studying the handbook and making notes on a piece of paper. You should get some rest, she said. Can't afford to lose the time. You can't afford to make mistakes because you're too tired to think straight either. Bojack set down his pencil and rubbed his eyes. Why'd you really ask me to do this? Martha rose. She was quiet for so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally, she said, because I needed to know if you were a man who finished what he started. And if I'm not, then you're not the man I thought you might be. 3 weeks in, Bojack had managed to construct 2 walls that stayed upright. The townspeople no longer gathered to watch his failures, which somehow made the small victories feel larger. Martha brought him coffee each morning before heading to her job at the seamstress shop, and each afternoon she'd find some excuse to walk past the construction site. Looking better, she said one evening, running her hand along a windowsill. He'd spent the entire day getting level. Still got a long way to go. Yes, you do. She didn't soften it, and he was grateful for that. False encouragement would have been worse than silence. The first real test came during a thunderstorm in early October. Martha woke in Mrs. Patterson's spare room to the sound of driving rain, and her first thought was of the house. She pulled on her boots and rain slicker and ran through the muddy streets. She found Bojack standing in what would be the parlor, water streaming down his face, trying to hold a tarp over a stack of lumber, while the wind did its best to tear it from his hands. "How stubborn fool," she shouted over the storm. "Get out of there before the lightning gets you." "Can't let the wood get soaked," he shouted back. Without thinking, Martha grabbed one corner of the tarp and helped him secure it. They worked, together in the darkness, lashing the covering down with rope, while the rain turned the construction site into a swamp. When they finally took shelter under the overhang of Mrs. Patterson's porch, both were soaked to the skin and shivering. "That was foolish," Martha said, wringing water from her hair. "Maybe, but the wood's dry." She looked at him, really looked at him. His lips were blue with cold, his clothes plastered to his frame, but his eyes held a determination she'd never seen before. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why what? Why does this matter so much to you? It's just a house, Bojack." He was quiet for a long time, watching the rain sheet off the porch roof. Finally, he said, "I never had a home growing up, not a real one. We moved around a lot, my ma and me, staying wherever we could until we wore out our welcome. And after she died," he shrugged, "been sleeping in bunkhouses and hotel rooms my whole adult life. I don't know what it feels like to belong somewhere. And you think building this house will change that? I think maybe it's not the house that makes a home. Maybe it's the person you build it for." Martha felt something shift in her chest, like ice breaking up on a spring river. The next morning, she brought him coffee and a plate of biscuits with honey. "You don't have to feed me," he said, but he ate every crumb. "I know I don't have to." By mid-October, the frame was complete, and Bojack was ready to start on the roof. Martha watched him carefully, measuring and cutting shingles, his movements, more confident now, his hands sure on the tools. "You're getting good at this," she said. "Had a good teacher." He held up the handbook, now dough-geared and stained with sweat and sawdust. "No," Martha said quietly, "you had the desire to learn. That's different." That afternoon, while Bojack was at the lumberyard, Martha found herself standing inside the frame of the house, imagining how it would look finished. She could picture furniture, rugs, curtains at the windows. She could almost hear children's laughter echoing off walls that didn't yet exist. The thought scared her. "Ma'am?" She turned to find young Tommy Henderson peering through what would be the front door. "Hello, Tommy. Is this going to be your new house?" "Maybe. It's a lot bigger than your old one." "Yes, it is." "You could fit a whole family in here." Martha's throat tightened. "I suppose you could." That evening, she found Bojack working on the porch railings by lamplight, carving something into the wood with painstaking care. "What are you doing?" He looked up, almost shy. "Making it permanent." She moved closer and saw her initials, MR, carved into the top rail, surrounded by a simple but elegant pattern of vines and flowers. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "House should have the owner's mark on it." "I'm not the owner yet." "No, ma'am, but you will be." November arrived with an early snowfall that sent Bojack into a panic. The roof was only half shingled, and winter was bearing down on them faster than expected. "I need more time," he said, standing in Martha's parlor at Mrs. Patterson's house, his hat in his hands. "Time's not something I can give you, Mr. Carter. Winter doesn't wait for anyone. Just another month, maybe 6 weeks." Martha shook her head. "I told you what the deadline was. I meant it. But I'm so close. Close doesn't keep the snow out." Bojack's frustration finally boiled over. "Why are you being so hard about this? Can't you see I'm trying?" "Trying isn't the same as doing," Martha snapped back. "My husband tried to finish things for 7 years. I won't live that way again." "I ain't your husband." "No, you're not. And if you can't finish what you started, you never will be." Bojack left without another word, and Martha told herself she was glad. Better to know now that he was just another man who made promises he couldn't keep. But that night, she couldn't sleep. She found herself at the window, looking toward her property, and was surprised to see lamplight flickering in the skeleton of the house. She pulled on her coat and walked through the snow. She found Bojack on the roof, working alone. In the bitter cold, his breath visible in the lamplight as he hammered shingles into place. His movements were methodical, relentless, like a man possessed. "Bojack, come down from there. You'll freeze to death." He didn't stop working. "Can't. Got to finish. It's too cold. The wood will split. Then I'll replace what splits." Martha climbed the ladder he'd leaned against the side of the house, something she never would have imagined doing a month ago. When she reached the roof, she found him bleeding from multiple small cuts where the cold had made his hands clumsy with the tools. "You stubborn fool, look at your hands." "They'll heal." "Not if you freeze them solid first." She took the hammer from his grip. "Come down. We'll get you warmed up and you can start again in the morning." No time, snow's coming harder tomorrow. How do you know? Can smell it. Martha looked up at the heavy clouds and realized he was right. The storm building overhead would dump another foot of snow before dawn. Then I'll help you. Bojack finally stopped working and looked at her. You don't know how to shingle a roof. Then teach me. They worked through the night, Martha handing him materials and holding the lamp, while Bojack battled the elements and his own exhaustion. By dawn, the roof was complete, and they sat side by side on the peak, watching the sun rise over their handiwork. We did it, Martha said wonderingly. You did it, Bojack corrected. I just swung the hammer. No, she said firmly. We did it. Together. As if summoned by their success, the snow began to fall in earnest, thick flakes that would soon blanket the town. But the house was ready. The roof was solid. The walls were tight. And for the first time in 2 years, Martha Rose felt like she might have a real home. The first thing Bojack did when the house was finished was install a proper front door, solid oak with brass hinges, and a lock that turned smooth as silk. The second thing he did was hand Martha the key. It's your house, he said simply. Martha held the key in her palm, feeling its weight. No, she said finally. It's our house, if you still want it to be. Bojack's answer was to sweep her up in his arms and carry her across the threshold. The inside of the house was still raw. Unfinished floors, bare walls, gaps where furniture would go. But it was sound and solid and theirs. We'll need to get married first, Martha said practically, even as she felt her heart racing. Soon as you're ready. I'm ready now. They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher, with half of Deadwood in attendance. The wedding feast was held in their new parlor, with tables borrowed from the church, and food contributed by neighbors who'd watched Bojack's struggle and Martha's gradual thaw with fascination. Never seen anything like it, Mrs. Henderson confided to Mrs. Patterson as they watched the newlyweds dance on their unfinished floor. That man literally built his way into her heart. Built them both a future, Mrs. Patterson replied. That's what a real man does. As winter deepened, Martha and Bojack settled into married life with surprising ease. He'd hired on as the town's deputy sheriff, a job that used his intimidating presence but required restraint rather than violence. She continued her seamstress, work but now from a proper sewing room with windows that let in good light. In the evenings, they worked together on finishing the house. Bojack built furniture, a kitchen table, chairs, shelves for Martha's books. Martha sewed curtains, braided rugs, and slowly transformed the raw space into a home that was unmistakably theirs. The first baby came the next fall, a daughter they named Rose after Martha's grandmother. Bojack held his child with hands that had learned to be gentle with precious things, and Martha watched him discover a tenderness she suspected he'd never known he possessed. She's so small, he marveled. She'll grow, Martha said, already exhausted but smiling. They always do. 2 years later came a son they named Thomas after Martha's first husband. It was Bojack's idea, and Martha loved him even more for it. Past doesn't disappear just because you build something new, he said when she questioned the choice. But it doesn't have to define what comes next either. By their 5th anniversary, the house had grown. An addition for the children, a workshop for Bojack, a proper garden for Martha. What had started as a challenge between two lonely people had become the foundation for a family, a legacy, a life neither had dared to imagine. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the house was still, Martha and Bojack would sit on the porch he'd built, watching the sun set over the land they'd made their own. Do you ever regret it? Martha asked one such evening. The challenge I gave you? Bojack considered the question seriously, as he did most things. I regret that I had to prove I was worth loving. But I don't regret learning how to build something that lasts. And what did you learn? That a house is just wood and nails until you fill it with people who matter. That finishing something you start isn't about the thing itself. It's about becoming the kind of person who keeps their word. He took her hand, calloused from years of work, strong from years of holding things together. And that sometimes the best foundation isn't what you build on the ground, but what you build in here. He touched his chest over his heart. Martha leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm and permanent. "I love you, Bojack Carter." "I love you too, Martha Rose Carter." Above them, the house they'd built together stood strong against the prairie wind, its windows glowing with lamplight, its walls echoing with the sounds of family, its foundation deep enough to weather any storm. In the distance, a new family had just arrived in Deadwood, their wagon loaded with dreams and determination. Perhaps they would build something lasting too. Perhaps they would learn, as Bojack and Martha had learned, that the strongest structures aren't made of wood and stone, but of trust and commitment and the daily choice to keep building together, one board at a time. The house on the hill stood as proof that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding each other, but about creating something together that will outlast you both. And in Deadwood, where the wind still carries the scent of sawdust and dreams, they still tell the story of the giant cowboy who built a home to win a heart, and the widow who taught him that some things are worth the building. He came with strength but stayed because she taught him where it should live. The sound of hammering echoed across the prairie once again, but this time it came from behind the Carter house, where a second structure was taking shape. Thomas Carter, now 19 and built like his adoptive father, worked alongside Bojack to raise the frame of what would be his sister Rose's new home. "Pa, this beam's warped," Thomas called out, running his hand along a piece of lumber with the practiced eye of someone raised around construction. "Then we fix it or replace it," Bojack replied, his hair now silver but his shoulders still broad. "Your sister deserves straight walls, same as anyone." Rose Carter, now Rose Carter Whitman, after her marriage to the schoolteacher's son, watched from the porch of the main house, her hand resting on her rounded belly. At 21, she had her mother's auburn hair and her father's determination, along with something entirely her own, an artist's eye that saw beauty in the simplest things. "They're arguing about the placement of the kitchen window again," she called to her mother, who was hanging laundry on the same line strung between the same two trees, now grown tall and full. Martha, now 48 with silver threading through her hair, smiled without looking up from her work. "Let them argue. Your father learned long ago that happy wives make for peaceful homes." The addition of Rose's house to the property hadn't been planned exactly. When she'd announced her engagement to Michael Whitman, the assumption had been that they'd find their own place in town. But Deadwood had grown, and suitable land had become expensive. More importantly, the Carters had discovered that family was something you kept close when you could. "Besides," Bojack had said when Rose had worried about being a burden, "this land's big enough for 3 generations, and I'm getting old enough to want my grandchildren within spoiling distance." Martha had simply added, "And I'm not getting any younger. I could use the help when that baby comes." So the project had begun. A house for Rose and Michael that would be connected to the main house by a covered walkway, sharing the well and the root cellar, but maintaining independence. It was, Martha had observed, like watching her husband court her all over again. The same careful attention to detail, the same determination to build something that would last. "Remember when Pa couldn't hammer a nail straight?" Thomas asked. During their midday break, wiping sweat from his forehead with a gesture unconsciously identical to his father's. "I remember when your Pa couldn't do a lot of things," Martha replied, bringing them cool water and sandwiches. "He's learned." "We all have," Bojack said quietly, accepting the glass she offered. "Still learning." The truth was, the years had changed them all in ways both subtle and profound. Bojack had never returned to the violence that had once defined him. As deputy sheriff, then eventually mayor of Deadwood, he'd built a reputation for fairness and an uncanny ability to talk down situations that might once have ended in bloodshed. "It's because he knows what it feels like to build something," Martha had explained to the ladies' auxiliary when they'd marveled at his transformation. "A man who's built a home with his own hands doesn't want to see anything torn down unnecessarily." Martha herself had become something of a legend in the territory. Her seamstress work had evolved into a business that employed 6 women and supplied clothing to families as far away as Rapid City. But more than that, she'd become the person young couples came to when they were struggling, when they needed advice on building not just houses but marriages. She's got a way of seeing straight to the heart of things, people said. Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, if you're willing to do the work, she'll help you figure out how. The Carter house itself had become a landmark of sorts. Travelers passing through Deadwood would often ask to see the house the giant built for love, and Martha had grown accustomed to finding strangers standing in her yard, studying the craftsmanship, the careful details, the way the structure had been expanded and modified over the years without losing its essential character. It's like watching a marriage, she'd overheard one visitor say to another. Starts with a good foundation, then grows as the family grows, adapts to what's needed, but never loses what made it strong in the first place. Young Sarah Miller arrived at the Carter house on a Tuesday morning in late spring, carrying a carpet bag and wearing the determined expression of someone who'd made a difficult decision. She was 18, fresh from the East, and engaged to a man she'd met through correspondence. "Mrs. Carter," she called from the gate, uncertain. Martha looked up from her garden, where she was planting the wildflowers that had become her signature, descendants of the ones she'd first planted, while watching Bo Jack build their home. "Yes, dear. I was told you might have advice about marriage, about knowing if someone is worth the risk." Martha set down her trowel and really looked at the girl, young, pretty in a fragile way, but with steel in her spine that reminded Martha of someone she'd once known. "Come sit," Martha said, gesturing to the porch swing Bo Jack had built when Rose was little. "What's troubling you?" Sarah's story tumbled out in a rush. She'd been corresponding with a rancher named James Peterson, a widower with 2 young children who needed a wife and mother. The arrangement made sense on paper, but now that she was here, now that she'd seen him, "He's not what I expected," she said finally. "How so?" "He's rough, angry. The children are afraid of him. And when I asked about the house, about where we'd live," Sarah's voice trailed off. "What about the house?" "It's falling apart. Roof leaks, windows broken, weeds growing up through the floorboards. He says there's no time to fix it, no money for improvements. Says a woman should be grateful for any roof over her head." Martha was quiet for a long moment, remembering a younger version of herself standing on a different porch, facing a similar decision. "What does your heart tell you?" she asked finally. "That I should run, but I've got nowhere to go, no money. Far passage back east, and he's not cruel exactly, just not willing to build something worth having." Sarah nodded miserably. Martha stood and walked to the porch railing, running her hand along the wood that still bore her initials after all these years. "Can I tell you a story?" For the next hour, Martha told Sarah about her own challenge to Bo Jack, about the long nights of construction, about learning to tell the difference between a man who talked about commitment and a man who demonstrated. "Tausdam, but how did you know?" Sarah asked when the story was finished. "How did you know he would actually do it?" "I didn't," Martha admitted. "That was the point. I couldn't know what kind of man he was until I saw what he was willing to sacrifice for what he claimed to want." "And Mr. Peterson? What has he sacrificed? What has he built? What has he finished?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, thinking. Finally, she said, "Nothing. He talks about what he's going to do, what he plans to accomplish, but the children told me he's been saying the same things for 2 years." "Then you have your answer." That afternoon, Martha helped Sarah compose a letter declining Mr. Peterson's proposal. More than that, she offered the girl a job in her sewing business and a room in the boarding house run by Mrs. Patterson's daughter. "You don't have to marry the first man who offers," Martha told her, "and you certainly don't have to marry a man who won't build you a life worth living." 6 months later, Sarah married the new banker, a quiet man named David Chen, who'd arrived from San Francisco with modern ideas about business and old-fashioned ideas about treating a wife well. Their courtship had been proper and brief, but Martha had approved when she'd seen David spending his evenings building Sarah a hope chest with his own hands, carving her initials into the lid with the same care Bo Jack had once shown. "Another. One saved from settling," Bo Jack observed, watching the young couple dance at their wedding celebration. "Another one who learned to expect better," Martha corrected. Chapter 8. Full Circle. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, 23 years after Bojack had first knocked on Martha's door. It was addressed to the Carter family, Deadwood, South Dakota, in careful script, and the return address showed it had come from Boston. Rose, now the mother of 3 children and pregnant with her 4th, was the one who opened it. "Ma, Pa, you need to see this," she called from the kitchen. The letter was from a young woman named Elizabeth Mason, and it began, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Carter, you don't know me, but I've heard your story from my grandmother, who heard it from a traveling merchant who passed through Deadwood some years ago. I'm writing because I find myself in a situation that reminds me of the tale she told." The rest of the letter detailed a familiar story, a young woman being courted by a man of questionable character, family pressure to accept a proposal that felt wrong, the need for advice from someone who'd navigated similar waters. I know it's presumptuous to write to strangers, but something about your story gives me hope that there are still people in the world who understand that love should build you up, not tear you down. Any wisdom you could share would be gratefully received. Martha and Bojack exchanged glances across the kitchen table. "How many does this make?" Bojack asked. "This year? Maybe a dozen overall?" Martha shook her head. "I stopped counting. Over the years, their story had traveled in the way stories do, told and retold, embellished and simplified, but always carrying the same essential truth, that real love required real commitment, and real commitment could be measured in actions, not words." Martha had taken to corresponding with the young women who wrote to her, offering advice, encouragement, and sometimes practical help. She'd even established a small fund, contributed to by families throughout the territory, to help women who needed to escape bad situations or start over somewhere new. "It's funny," she said, reading Elizabeth's letter again. "I challenged you to build me a house. Turns out we built something much bigger. What's that? Hope. For people who thought they had to settle for less than they deserved." That evening, Martha sat down to write her response to Elizabeth. She told the young woman about the difference between a man who made promises and a man who kept them, about the importance of seeing actions rather than hearing words, about the courage it took to demand better. But mostly, she told her about love. Real love, the kind that built foundations strong enough to weather any storm. "Love isn't just a feeling," she wrote. "It's a choice, made new every day. And it's work, hard, patient, sometimes thankless work. But when you find someone willing to do that work with you, to build something together that's stronger than either of you could create alone, that's when you know you've found something worth keeping. Trust your instincts, demand better, and remember that a man who won't build you a life worth living isn't worthy of sharing the one you've built for yourself. With hope and affection, Martha Rose Carter Deadwood, South Dakota, PS." If you ever find yourself in the Dakota Territory, you're welcome at our table. We've always got room for one more. Thomas Carter stood in the main room of the house his father had built, now serving as the gathering place for 4 generations of family. His own children, twin boys of 10 and a daughter of 8, sat around the massive table Bojack had crafted during that first winter, listening to their grandfather tell the story of how he'd won their grandmother's heart. It was Christmas Eve 1911, and snow fell softly outside the windows that had never leaked, past the walls that had never sagged, onto the porch that still bore Martha's initials carved deep into the rail. Bojack, now 65, still filled a chair completely, though his hair was white and his hands bore the permanent stains of a lifetime of honest work. Martha, 61, moved between kitchen and parlor with the easy grace of a woman comfortable in her own home, her own skin, her own life. Rose and her husband Michael had come from their house next door, bringing their 4 children. Thomas and his wife Anne had traveled from their ranch outside of town with their 3. Even young Samuel, Bojack and Martha's surprise late in life, child now 15 and lanky as a scarecrow, had dragged himself away from his books to join the family gathering. "Tell about the storm, Grandpapa," demanded little Mary, Thomas's daughter, who had inherited her great-grandmother's red hair and determination. "Which storm?" Bojack asked, though he knew exactly which one she meant. "The one where you and Grandma Martha worked all night to save the roof?" So Bojack told the story again, the way he told it every year, with Martha adding details he forgot and the children hanging on every word. It was a family story now, worn smooth by repetition, but no less precious for being familiar. The thing is, Bojack concluded, looking around the table at faces that carried pieces of his own and Martha's, a house is just the beginning. It's what you fill it with that makes it home. What did you fill it with? Asked James, one of the twins. Bojack smiled, the same slow smile that had melted Martha's defenses all those years ago. Love, arguments, laughter, tears, dreams, children, grandchildren, Christmas mornings and ordinary Tuesdays, all the things that make a life worth living. Later, after the children had been tucked into beds throughout the house and the adults had lingered over coffee and Martha's famous apple pie, Bojack found himself alone with Martha on the porch swing, wrapped in quilts she'd sewn, watching the snow fall on the town they'd helped build. "Any regrets?" Martha asked, the same question she'd asked periodically over the years. "About what?" "Any of it. All of it." Bojack considered, as he always did. "I regret that it took me 32 years to find you. I regret that Thomas, your first Thomas, couldn't see what we've seen. I regret that we lost the baby between Rose and Samuel, though I know that's not something we could control." He paused. "But regret the challenge you gave me. Regret the life we built. Never." "Good," Martha said, settling deeper into his side, "because I was thinking we might need to add on again." "Oh? Someone getting married?" "No. But Rose told me she's expecting again. And Michael's talking about expanding his teaching practice. They're going to need more room." Bojack laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet yard. "At 65, you want me to start building again?" "Not you. Us. All of us. That's how families work, isn't it? Everyone builds together." Bojack looked out at the property they'd created together. The main house, Rose's house connected by the covered walkway, Thomas's old workshop now converted to Samuel's study, the barn that housed Martha's expanded sewing operation, the garden that produced enough vegetables to feed 3 families, the chicken coop, the root cellar, the well that had never run dry. It was more than he'd ever imagined when he'd first driven stakes into the ground with shaking hands and a battered handbook. It was a legacy, a place that would outlast them both, a foundation strong enough to support generations of dreams. "All right," he said finally, "but this time I'm hiring help. I'm too old to be stubborn about accepting assistance." "This time," Martha agreed, "we all build together from the beginning." Above them, the stars shone down on Deadwood South, Dakota, where the story of the giant cowboy and the challenging widow had become legend. But the legend was just the beginning. The real story was here, in the house that love built, surrounded by the lives that love had made possible, anchored by the truth that the strongest foundations aren't made of wood and stone, but of commitment, kept, promises honored, and the daily choice to keep building together. In the distance, a new family's wagon could be seen making its way down the main street, loaded with hopes and dreams and the courage to start over. Perhaps they too would learn what Bojack and Martha had learned, that love isn't just found. It's built one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of faith at a time. And in the house on the hill, where the walls still stood straight and the roof still kept out the rain, the Carter family slept peacefully, surrounded by the evidence that some things, the best things, are worth the building. The year 1918 brought changes that no one in Deadwood could have anticipated. The Great War had ended, but its aftermath reached even into the quiet corners of the Dakota Territory. Young men returned, changed, if they returned at all. The Spanish flu swept through communities like wildfire, and even families as established, as the Carters found themselves tested in ways they'd never imagined. It started with Samuel, now 22, and fresh from his studies at the university in Rapid City. He'd returned home with grand ideas about modernizing the family businesses and a head full of engineering knowledge that sometimes made his father feel ancient. "Pa, we could install electric lighting throughout the house," Samuel argued over dinner one evening in March. "And indoor plumbing. The technology exists now." Bojack, now 72 but still sharp, considered his youngest son's proposal. "And what's wrong with the house the way it is?" Nothing's wrong with it, Samuel said quickly, recognizing the dangerous ground he was treading. It's just, we could make it better, more modern, more comfortable for Ma. Martha, now 68, and moving a bit slower but still formidable, looked up from her sewing. Don't use me as an excuse for your gadgets, Samuel Carter. I've been comfortable in this house for 30 years. But think about it, Samuel pressed on. Electric lights would be safer than oil lamps, and a proper bathroom upstairs would save you from going outside in the winter. Rose, now 41 and the mother of 6, laughed from her seat by the fire. Samuel, you sound like every salesman who's ever tried to convince Pa to buy something he doesn't need. This is different. These improvements would add value to the property, make our lives easier. Thomas, visiting with his family for the week, shook his head. You can't improve on something that's already perfect, little brother. The conversation might have ended there, as so many family discussions did, with gentle ribbing and eventual agreement to disagree. But then Martha surprised them all. Show me, she said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. I said, show me. If you think these improvements would make the house better, Samuel, then show me how they'd work. Don't just talk about them. Build them. Bojack's eyebrows shot up. After all these years, Martha was still issuing challenges. Ma, I'd need to hire electricians, plumbers, Samuel began. Then hire them. But you oversee the work. You make sure it's done right. You take responsibility for making sure these modern conveniences actually work the way you claim they will. Samuel looked around the table at his family's faces, seeing everything from amusement to skepticism to outright doubt. All right, he said finally. I will. But when it's done, when you see how much better life can be with these improvements, I don't want to hear any complaints about change. Martha smiled, the same smile that had launched 1,000 building projects. When it's done right, Samuel, there won't be any complaints. The installation of electricity and indoor plumbing in the Carter house became the talk of Deadwood. Every day brought new spectators who came to watch the workmen string wires and install fixtures that seemed like magic to people accustomed to oil lamps and outdoor privies. Samuel threw himself into the project with the same determination his father had once shown, but with the benefit of education and hired expertise. He studied electrical diagrams late into the night, consulted with engineers by telegraph, and drove his workers to distraction with his attention to detail. He's got his father's perfectionism, Martha observed to Rose one afternoon as they watched Samuel examine every connection box with a magnifying glass. And your stubbornness, Rose replied. He's been working 18-hour days for 2 weeks straight. The project wasn't without its setbacks. A miscalculation in the wiring caused a small fire that damaged one wall of the parlor. Her problem with the water pressure meant the upstairs bathroom fixtures had to be reinstalled twice. And the cost, well, the cost was considerably more than Samuel had originally estimated. But Bojack, watching his son navigate these challenges, found himself remembering his own struggles with that first house. The collapsed walls, the storms, the moments of doubt and despair. Having second thoughts, he asked Samuel one evening, after a particularly frustrating day dealing with a faulty electrical panel. Samuel, covered in dust and exhaustion, looked up from the manual he was studying. Every day, but backing out now would mean admitting defeat. And Carters don't quit. Bojack smiled. No, son, they don't. The work took 3 months, twice, as long as Samuel had promised, and 3 times as expensive as he'd budgeted. But when it was finished, the transformation was remarkable. Electric lights bathed every room in clean, bright illumination. Hot water flowed from taps throughout the house. The new bathroom upstairs was a marvel of modern convenience, with a porcelain tub deep enough to soak in and a toilet that actually flushed. The family gathered for the grand unveiling on a warm evening in June. Samuel, nervous as a bridegroom, led them from room to room, demonstrating each modern miracle. Well, he asked finally, standing in the parlor where electric bulbs cast everything in golden light. Martha walked slowly around the room, testing light switches, examining fixtures, running her hand along walls that had been repaired and repainted. Finally, she returned to where Samuel stood waiting. It's beautiful, she said simply, And it works. Samuel's relief was visible. So you approve? I approve of the work. I approve of your commitment to seeing it through. And I approve of your willingness to take responsibility for making it right when things went wrong. Bojack put his hand on his son's shoulder. You did good, boy. Real good. Thanks, Pa. Though I have to say I have a lot more respect now for what you went through building this place originally. At least I had help. Everyone should have help, Martha said. That's what family is for. The modern conveniences proved their worth that winter when the Spanish flu reached Deadwood. The Carter house, with its electric lights and hot running water, became an unofficial infirmary for family members and neighbors who fell ill. Rose was the first to succumb, collapsing while tending to one of her children who'd developed a fever. Within days, half the extended family was showing symptoms. Martha, despite her age, insisted on serving as chief nurse, using the upstairs bathroom to maintain the kind of sanitation that would have been impossible in the old days. Thank God for Samuel's improvements, she told Bojack one night as they sat by Rose's bedside, watching their daughter fight the fever. I don't know how we would have managed this with just oil lamps and outdoor facilities. Bojack, who had so far remained healthy, nodded grimly. The boy was right. Sometimes change is necessary. Not change for its own sake, Martha corrected, but change that serves a purpose that makes life better for the people you love. Rose recovered, as did most of the family, but the experience left them all sobered by how quickly their secure world could be threatened. 3 families in town hadn't been as fortunate, and the Carter house hosted its share of funerals that spring. Makes you appreciate what you have, Thomas said during one of his visits, and makes you want to hold on to it tighter, or share it more freely, Martha replied. We've been blessed, that comes with responsibility. She was thinking of the letters that still arrived regularly from young women seeking advice, of the families in town who struggled to make ends meet, of the returning soldiers who needed work and purpose. What are you planning, Ma? Samuel asked, recognizing the look in her eyes. I'm thinking this house has served our family well for 30 years. Maybe it's time it served the community too. Martha's idea was characteristically simple and characteristically ambitious. Transform part of the Carter property into a place where young couples could learn the skills they needed to build their own lasting relationships. We'll call it the Carter Family Institute, she announced at Sunday dinner. Not a school exactly, but a place where people can come to learn practical skills. Building, sewing, cooking, managing money, raising children, all the things you need to know to make a marriage work. The family reaction was mixed. Rose worried about strangers overrunning their peaceful home. Thomas questioned whether there was really a need for such an institution. Samuel immediately began calculating costs and logistics. But Bojack surprised everyone by being the first to voice enthusiastic support. Your mother's right, he said. We've learned things over the years that might help other people avoid some of the mistakes we made. And God knows there are plenty of young folks who could use guidance. You'd teach construction? Samuel asked. I'd teach building, Bojack clarified. Not just how to put up walls, but how to plan for the future, how to solve problems when things go wrong, how to work with your hands and your head together. Martha smiled at him across the table. And I'd teach the things I learned from watching you, how to tell the difference between a man who talks and a man who acts, how to demand better for yourself without settling for less than you deserve. The Carter Family Institute opened its doors in the spring of 1920, operating out of the workshop and expanded parlor of the main house. The first class consisted of 6 couples from Deadwood and the surrounding area, all engaged or newly married, all eager to learn from people whose love story had become legendary. Bojack taught construction basics, but more than that, he taught the philosophy behind building, the importance of solid foundations, the value of quality materials, the necessity of patience and persistence. Martha taught practical household management, but also relationship skills, communication, conflict resolution, the art of compromise without surrender. Rose contributed lessons on child rearing. Thomas shared knowledge about managing finances and planning for the future, and Samuel brought modern innovations and efficiency techniques. The curriculum was unlike anything available elsewhere. Students learn to build furniture together, to plan and plant gardens, to manage household budgets as a team. They studied the Carter marriage as a case study in successful partnership, learning from both the successes and the failures. The thing is, Bojack told one group of young men as they struggled to construct a simple table, building something together teaches you about each other in ways that just talking never could. You learn who gives up when things get hard, who blames others for their mistakes, who's willing to start over when necessary. And you learn who you can depend on, added young James Morrison, whose table was taking shape nicely thanks to his fiancée's steady hand with a saw. Mary's better at this than I am, and that's not easy for a man to admit. Then you're learning the most important lesson of all, Martha said from where she was observing the class. Marriage isn't about one person being in charge and the other following orders. It's about both people contributing their strengths to build something neither could create alone. The Institute's success brought unexpected challenges. By 1923, they had a waiting list of couples wanting to attend, inquiries from other communities about starting similar programs, and requests from universities for Martha and Bojack to come speak about their methods. But success also brought scrutiny. Some of the more conservative residents of Deadwood worried that the Institute was promoting radical ideas about marriage and family roles. When Martha began teaching women basic construction skills, and Bojack started showing men how to cook and clean, eyebrows raised throughout the territory. The controversy came to a head during a heated town council meeting in October 1923. Reverend William Thornton, newly arrived from Chicago, stood before the council and the packed audience to voice his concerns. What we have here, he declared, is a direct assault on the natural order of things. Men are meant to be the providers and protectors, women the nurturers and keepers of the home. This institute teaches dangerous ideas about equality that go against both nature and scripture. Several heads nodded in agreement. But then Martha Rose Carter stood up. At 73, she was still a formidable presence. Her hair was completely silver now, her face lined with age, but her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived fully and learned deeply. Reverend Thornton, she said calmly, I appreciate your concern for the moral welfare of our community, but I wonder if you've actually observed our classes before drawing your conclusions. I've heard enough to know. You've heard gossip and speculation. I'm inviting you to come see for yourself what we actually teach. The Reverend looked trapped. Refusing would make him appear closed-minded, but accepting might expose him to ideas he'd already condemned. Very well, he said finally. I'll observe your next session. 3 days later, Reverend Thornton arrived at the Carter house to find 12 couples working on their final project. Each pair was constructing a hope chest that they would take home as a symbol of their commitment to building a life together. He watched as husbands and wives collaborated on measurements, discussed design choices, solved problems together. He saw men teaching women how to use tools, and women teaching men how to organize household supplies. He observed couples who clearly respected each other's contributions and valued each other's opinions. Most importantly, he watched Bojack and Martha work together, their partnership as natural and seamless after 35 years, as if they were two parts of a single person. Reverend, called out Rebecca Sullivan, one of the students, could you help us settle a debate? My husband thinks we should use pine for our chest, but I prefer oak. What do you think? Before Thornton could answer, Bojack stepped over. What's the chest for? How do you plan to use it? Family documents, linens, things we want to preserve, David Sullivan replied. Then you want oak, Bojack said. Pine's fine for everyday furniture, but oak lasts generations. Costs more up front, but it's worth it for something you're planning to pass down to your children. See, Rebecca smiled at her husband, sometimes the woman's instincts are right. And sometimes the man's budget concerns are valid too, Martha added, joining the conversation. Have you considered starting with pine for now, but planning to build an oak chest in a few years when you're more established? The young couple looked at each other and nodded. That makes sense, David said. We're thinking too much about right now instead of planning for the future. That's the point of the exercise, Martha explained to Reverend Thornton. Learning to balance immediate needs with long-term goals, individual preferences with shared priorities. At the end of the session, as couples cleaned up their work areas and prepared to leave, Reverend Thornton approached Martha and Bojack. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I came here expecting to find radical ideology undermining traditional values. Instead, I found people learning to build stronger marriages and more stable homes." "No apology necessary," Martha replied. "You were protecting what you thought was right." "That's admirable. But I was wrong about your methods. What you're teaching here, it's not about overturning the natural order. It's about helping people find their own natural order, the partnership that works best for them." Bojack nodded. "Every marriage is different, Reverend. What worked for Martha and me might not work for everyone. But the principles, respect, commitment, shared responsibility, working together toward common goals, those are universal. Would you be willing to speak to my congregation about your work here?" Martha and Bojack exchanged glances. "We'd be honored," Martha said. By 1925, the Carter Family Institute had become a recognized institution throughout the Dakota Territory and beyond. Couples traveled from as far away as Minnesota and Nebraska to attend the intensive 2-week program. Several universities had sent researchers to study their methods, and Martha had been invited to speak at women's colleges across the Midwest. But the real measure of their success wasn't in the recognition or the numbers, it was in the letters that arrived regularly from former students, reporting on marriages that were thriving, homes that were growing, families that were flourishing. "Listen to this one," Martha said, reading aloud from a letter that had arrived that morning. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Carter, it's been 3 years since John and I attended your program, and I wanted you to know that we just celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary by completing the addition to our house that we planned during your class. We used all the techniques Mr. Carter taught us, and for the first time in our marriage, a major project brought us closer together instead of driving us apart." Rose, now helping to manage the Institute's correspondence, smiled as she filed, "Another success story. That's the 15th letter this month reporting on successful home construction projects. And 7 new babies," added Samuel, who had taken over much of the Institute's business management, "plus 4 families who've started their own businesses based on skills they learned here." Bojack, now 79 and moving more slowly, but still sharp as a tack, looked around the parlor where another group of couples was working on their relationship-building exercises. Not bad for something that started with a stubborn woman and an even more stubborn man. "Don't forget the house," Martha added. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't been willing to build something that lasted." "We built something that lasted," Bojack corrected gently. "And we're still building it." It was true. The Carter property had grown to include not just the original house and Rose's addition, but also a dormitory for out-of-town students, a workshop building where construction classes were held, and a library that housed Martha's extensive collection of books on relationships, child-rearing, and home management. More importantly, the family had grown to include not just blood relatives, but the hundreds of couples who had passed through their program, the young women who still wrote for advice, the community members who had found support and guidance in their example. Thomas, now 57 and a grandfather himself, often marveled at what his parents had created. "You know, when I was young, I thought the house was the impressive thing, Pa building something from nothing with his own hands, but now I realize the house was just the beginning." "What do you mean?" asked his youngest daughter, Sarah, now 16 and helping with the Institute's clerical work. "I mean, they didn't just build a house. They built a way of living, a way of loving, a way of solving problems and facing challenges. And then they figured out how to teach other people to build the same thing for themselves." Martha, overhearing the conversation, felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fireplace. "That's the thing about building something that lasts," she said. "It doesn't stop with you. If you do it right, it becomes something that others can build on, improve, pass along to their own children." The winter of 1927 was harsh, even by Dakota standards. Snow fell early and deep, and the cold settled in with a permanence that made everyone feel older and more fragile. Bojack, now 81, found himself spending more time by the fire and less time in the workshop, though he still insisted on reviewing every construction project undertaken by institute students. Martha, at 77, had gradually turned over most of the institute's daily operations to Rose and Samuel, but she still conducted the weekly sessions on building relationships that last, discussions that had become legendary for their wisdom, humor, and unflinching honesty about the challenges of long-term commitment. It was during one of these sessions, on a February evening when the wind howled around the house but the electric lights burned steady and warm, that a young woman named Catherine Wells asked the question that would define Martha's final teaching. "Mrs. Carter," Catherine said, looking nervous but determined, "what do you do when you realize that no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you build together, one day it's all going to end? How do you keep building when you know it won't last forever?" The room fell silent. Catherine was newly married to a young man who had been diagnosed with a degenerative illness. They knew their time together would be limited, and the knowledge cast a shadow over every plan they made. Martha was quiet for a long moment, looking at Bojack across the room. In his eyes, she saw the same question Catherine had asked. They were both old now, and the reality of mortality was no longer something they could ignore. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the room. "Catherine, dear, you're asking the most important question anyone can ask, and the answer is this. We don't build things to last forever. We build them to matter while they're here." She stood slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered property where so much life had been lived, so much love had been shared. "When my Bojack first built this house, we thought we were building it to last a lifetime. And we were right. It has lasted our lifetime. But more than that, it's created space for other lifetimes. Our children's, our grandchildren's, our students' families." She turned back to Catherine and her husband, David, who sat, holding hands with the fierce grip of people who knew time was precious. "The love you build together, the home you create, the kindness you show each other, none of that disappears when one of you is gone. It becomes part of the foundation that others build on. Your children, if you have them, your friends who see how you love each other, the strangers who are inspired by your example." Bojack spoke from his chair by the fire, his voice still strong despite his age. "I've seen men die in bar fights over nothing, and I've seen men die peacefully in their beds, surrounded by families who will carry their love forward for generations. The length of time doesn't matter as much as what you do with the time you have." Catherine wiped her eyes. "But it's so hard knowing it will end." "Everything ends, child," Martha said gently. "Flowers bloom and die. Seasons change. Children grow up and leave home. But that doesn't make the blooming, the seasons, or the children less precious. Fate makes them more precious." She sat back down, taking Bojack's weathered hand in hers. "We've been married almost 40 years. One day, one of us will go first, and the other will be left behind. That knowledge doesn't make me love him less. It makes me treasure every ordinary Tuesday, every silly argument, every moment when he brings me coffee in the morning." David Wells spoke for the first time. "So we should just keep building, even knowing it won't last as long as we'd hoped?" "Especially then," Bojack replied. "Build with more intention, love with more purpose. Create something so beautiful, so strong that it echoes long after you're gone." Martha squeezed Bojack's hand. "When we're gone, this house will still stand. Our children will still remember the lessons we taught them. The couples who learn to build stronger marriages here will pass those lessons on to their own children. The foundation we laid will support structures we never imagined." She looked around the room at the faces of the young couples, all listening, intently. "That's what real building is, my dears. Not just creating something for yourself, but creating something that becomes part of the foundation for what comes next. Build your marriages to last not just your lifetime, but to create a legacy of love that outlasts you both."